So very good morning, distinguished participant. We are very fortunate today that this morning we have a group line of panelists, great panelists with us. And the topic for this session is addressing the challenge of green transition in developing countries. As all of us already know, we have this Paris Agreement, which we agreed to limit the global temperature to 1.5 to 2%, to 2 degrees Celsius. But the next question is how to formulate and to take a concrete steps related to that. And this effort will require a far-reaching and unprecedented effort related to that. Then it also requires funding. Yeah, according to the intergenerational panel of climate change, it is predicted that we probably need about 6% of global GDP. This is a very significant amount, probably around 4.5 to 5 trillion annually from 2021 to 2050. Yeah, we can imagine this is the huge amount of money. And then the basic question is how to get this source of funding. Perhaps we can get the funding from the domestic resource management, but also from not only the domestic, but also from the external. But unfortunately, as all of us know, that the pandemic has impacted many low and middle income countries. I can imagine, as a former Minister of Finance, the first question is, what should we put as a priority? And in addition to that, the geopolitical tension with the war in Ukraine also exacerbated the current situation because the high energy prices and also the food prices. And I can imagine many governments all over the world will focus to give the protection for the vulnerable groups. And this kind of situation may derail the commitment to sort of like to provide funding for this big effort in related to tackle the issue of this climate change. At the same time, we also see at the global level, due to the pandemic, there are many things need to be addressed, including the health issue, including the security issue. So this is really a big question that we need to address, and we are very fortunate that at this panel this morning, we have a very great lineup with us. Let me start with the gentleman sitting next to me, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, old friend, good friend of mine, is a former Deputy Chairman of India's Planning Commission, and also member of the high-level advisory group on sustainable and inclusive recovery and growth formed by the World Bank and the IMF. And we are also lucky, we have this Professor Kathy, correct me if I'm wrong to pronounce your surname, Hochstätzler, Professor of International Development and Head of Department of International Relations at the London School of Economics. And then we have also Dr. Adam Triggs. He's the director of the Alpha Beta and Accenture Strategy, and he's also one of the co-chairs of the Task Force 7, the T20 Indonesia. And last but not least, my good friend Habib Raib. He's the lead economist of the World Bank Jakarta. So basically we have all the experts with us this morning. And before I start, allow me to thank the Ford Foundation for supporting us to organize this event, this session, because without support from the Ford Foundation, it will be difficult for us to sort of like gather all these experts to come with us this morning. So let me start with this session by asking each of the speakers to give their remarks probably about 10 minutes, and after that we can go to the second round. So let me start with you, Montek.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Atib. It's really a great pleasure to be here in Indonesia, in beautiful Bali, my first visit to this famous island, and nice to be sharing the podium with you and others. This is a really tough area, and so I just want to make a few general comments on the whole issue of financing. Chatib mentioned this estimate of $5 to $6 trillion per year, which comes to approximately 5 to 6% of GDP. You know, countries spend a lot of money on things that they directly think will help them. It's much more difficult to spend money on something that is supposed to sort of help the whole world, and in that manner also kind of help you. Logically, it shouldn't be, but it is a reality. I mean, I was just mentioning that we've spent a huge amount of energy for the last several years trying to dig out the $100 billion per year that was promised way back in 2015, and it hasn't yet been achieved. But I was mentioning in the UK, during the prime ministerial race, the newly elected prime minister, about to be sworn in, I think today, has promised energy subsidies, approximately 100 billion pounds. Now that, we did a very quick calculation, comes to at least a couple of percent of UK's GDP, but was an immediate benefit to the people who vote for you. So I think this is a real issue. What exactly is the likelihood of being able to finance such an amount with a lot of international assistance? Now here, we are constrained by the fact that perhaps unrealistic expectations have been raised because the UNFCCC, under whose auspices all these negotiations are taking place, did sort of say that developing countries will be assisted to make both their mitigation and their adaptation effects. Now, if you read it very carefully, it didn't say assisted to meet all. It sort of said some agreed amount. So I think the first step is we ought to know what it's going to cost and what is the agreed amount of what is called assistance. A lot of the problem on the financing side comes because people say that, look, if the greening is good for the economy, I mean in the sense that without greening there'll be huge losses, and we believe that's true, then quite frankly, if the prices are right, it should be profitable to get into this area. And if it's profitable to get into this area, there's oodles of private money that's willing to flow. And therefore, there's really no need for financial assistance, although people will concede that for some of the poorer countries in Africa, etc., you do need something. Now, I mean, this notion of what is the additional cost is also conceptually quite difficult to define. Because, you know, when you ask people, what do you have to do? They will say immediately that, look, you've got to stop building coal-fired power plants. Of course, you need electricity, so you must build renewable energy plants, wind, solar, whatever. And in order to build so many gigawatts of these renewable energy plants, this is what it costs. But, you know, that's not the additional cost. The additional cost is the extra cost of going renewable rather than conventional. Because if you didn't build renewable power plants, you would be building conventional power plants. So the assumption has to be that if you really are planning an X% growth of the economy, and that's going to require a lot of power, normally you would have presumably financed it from conventional power. Now you're going to have to finance it through renewable power. What's the difference in cost? Now, you know, you do get a difference in the sense that renewable power is much more capital intensive, so you have to spend the money up front. But, you know, on the other side, it could be argued that you don't have to have any inputs. So like if you're building an extra power plant based on coal, you not only have to spend money on the coal, on the power plant, but you have to spend money on building the coal producing capacity. So that investment is therefore saved. So if you really work this out, to determine what is additional is complicated. And my guess is that the 6% figure is on the high side. And I know that some common friends of ours, Shatib and mine, Amar Bhattacharya, has done some very careful work on working out what's actually the additional cost. And for developing countries, he comes up with a conclusion that on a pretty comprehensive basis, including the cost of adjustment, which is different from just the green energy transition, the cost may be about 3% of GDP or something like that for developing countries, 3, 4%, whatever. Now, you know, 3 and 4% is not a huge sum of money if you're thinking of a transition that's going to take place over a period of 50 years. And some of this is actually going to be a redeployment of funds that you use in a particular way today, which you would not be using in that way, but you'd be using for the needs of the green economy. So that kind of reduces it a little further. But you know, even if you do all that, I think one thing is very clear. I don't think the international negotiations would come to an agreement that the entire additional cost, genuinely calculated to take account of these things, should be met by international assistance in the sense of concessional assistance. There will be an argument that, look, this is your problem, so some of this you must meet domestically by making a greater effort at domestic resource mobilization. That will bring in issues of how do you do the resource mobilization. Clearly, an obvious thing would be getting rid of fuel subsidies, because that's taking a lot of funds in most, certainly in my country, and I think in most developing countries also. Now, of course, even in developed countries, there are a lot of energy subsidies, but whatever it is, taking a longer term view, the argument would be, what are you doing to get rid of that? The second argument would be that if it's international assistance, does it have to be public flows, or does it have to be, I mean, actually the UNFCCC is quite clear in the sense of the Paris Agreement that the 100 billion was a combination of official and private flows. Nobody quite knew what flows would be eligible, they haven't been achieved, et cetera, et cetera. But looking forward, since this is really becoming serious, I think we need much better assessments. If you like, each country must make those assessments. That what is a realistic additional cost, taking account of the things that I've mentioned, also taking account of the fact that adaptation must be an important part, not just producing green energy. So that's one thing. What is the additional cost? It'll vary from country to country. And rather than rely on international studies, which is what we're doing right now, I think each country should do the study for itself, because that's really the way to, and let the international thing pull it together. That's point number one. Point number two is really, we need to determine in each country how much of these investments are going to be done in the public sector and how much are going to be done in the private sector. And my guess is that most countries are so fiscally stressed that given the choice between doing something in the public sector and doing something in the private sector, they would be well advised to do most of it in the private sector. But you know, certain things like adaptation, etc., don't have a direct revenue model associated with it. Therefore, that more or less has to be in the public sector. So putting adaptation as a priority in the public sector and recognizing the limitations, the fiscal limitations, that would give you the target for how much has to be done in the private sector. And I think there we also have to recognize that for these investments to actually appear attractive, the risks that are associated with these investments have to be moderated. Now, I have no doubt whatsoever that as and when people are ready to move to electric vehicles, the private investment that is currently producing internal combustion engine vehicles will switch with a little difficulty, but it will switch to producing electric vehicles, producing or assembling or whatever it is. But you know, When it comes to investing in the production of electricity, which is a regulated sector, and which is a sector where governments jump in even when market conditions suggest an increase in price. And I mentioned the case of the UK, and that's the most obvious one. So, you know, if you're taking your cue, if you like, from the more developed countries, the natural instinct in developing countries would be that we have to do the same thing. I think the fact that there would be somewhat arbitrary intervention in the electricity sector will discourage private investment from going in. Now, it's not a problem if all that happens in the electricity sector is the government gives big subsidies. I mean, the private sector doesn't care where the money comes from. It is a problem if they start putting caps. And really, in many of our countries, at least in India, the many ways in which governments might act to save public sector money, to save subsidies by capping prices. And that is clearly a risk which private sector will find very difficult to take. So all these things have to be weighed together. And my bottom line is, I think it's time, if we are talking about a transition of 40, 50 years or so, I think each developing country should do these calculations for itself and then see how we can get the money. It's not going to be solved instantly because we are talking about a transition over 3 decades. Well, I'll come back later. I think I've already exhausted my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Montek, for your excellent remarks. Now let me move to Kathy. You have 10 minutes for this.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and very grateful for the introduction. And it'll be interesting. We didn't coordinate our initial statements at all, or really any part of our answers. We coordinated some questions, but not our answers. And what I have to say in some ways really picks up on some themes that were coming up here, and then I go a different direction. And I think a lot of that actually has to do with the fact that unlike many of the people at this conference, my background is in the study of politics more than in the study of economics. So maybe not surprisingly then, I take a political turn in my analysis of things. But I also want to start then with some of the ways that the problem was initially set up, because I think that this is a really important part of understanding why this issue is so complicated. That when you think about the interests involved in dealing with climate change, we clearly all have these interests in addressing climate change, but in many ways they're quite long-term, although they're becoming shorter-term. And then we have what our moderator pointed out, which is that there's always something in the short term that seems more urgent. Right now it's COVID, right now it's the war in Ukraine, but there's always something. And so climate change poses us that basic problem of these really long-term interests, but also then these much more urgent short-term interests. And I think if we wait until there are no urgent short-term interests, we'll never address climate change, because there will always be urgent short-term interests. And so part of what I'm trying to think through is how do we think about climate change in a way that makes it also urgent in the short term, or something that we really want to work on in the short term. And another thing that my colleagues have mentioned too is the fact that climate change is a global commons issue, and that in some ways it can be complicated to decide to take action on climate change, because the things that you and your country do for the benefit of climate change benefit the world, right? And there's such an incentive then to let other countries and other actors act instead while you free ride and you don't act, you don't do the difficult things, you wait for others to do them, like Liz Truss is going to do in the UK where I live. So this is a panel on developing countries. I think in many ways some of these dynamics are true of developed countries and developing countries. So we have this problem then with climate change, in that it is a very complicated issue around which to organize action. And I would argue, and people in my discipline of politics are starting increasingly to look at this issue, is that actually a better way to think about climate change as an issue and decarbonization as an issue is to understand that it is today very profoundly a distributional issue. It is an issue that produces winners and losers today. And that certainly, and now here's where I'm veering into politics, that certainly one of the things that we have to understand when we look at climate action is the fact that there are a large number of very powerful actors, both business actors and countries, whose wealth and power depends on fossil fuels. And that this is a set of actors that are going to be part of our larger picture of taking climate action. So I don't, in fact, believe that it's just a matter of getting the prices right. I think that even if we get the prices right, that we have actors in this current political economy. Now, this is the political economy turn, not just thinking about economics, but we have actors in this political economy that are very much working against us taking action on climate change. And certainly in my home country of the United States, fossil fuel actors have denied, they have hidden, they have used their powers of political persuasion to very much work against the United States taking action on climate change, which is, of course, part of the bigger problem of not enough finance, not enough conviction, not enough action at the global level. And so I would argue that we can't just wait for the prices to get right, because even when the prices get right, there can still be action against, mobilization against taking action on climate change. So we need to be much more directly political in our thinking about how it is that we mobilize the kind of choices that we need in order to address climate change. And so part of that is thinking about, well, what do countries choose to spend money on? And you've mentioned fossil fuels, and you mentioned fossil fuels yesterday in the panel on energy. Is this not working properly? Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. Okay. So if we think about where our resources going, resources are going, we know from the IMF, in the trillions to fossil fuel subsidies. So it's not really a question of there not being resources. It's a question in part of what it is that countries choose to spend their resources on. And right now, they are choosing to spend many more resources on fossil fuel subsidies than they are spending on energy transition. And so I think at least some of the question about where do we find the finance for addressing climate change is that we find the finance in part by taking on the political fight of challenging the power of actors that are deliberately working against these transitions happening. But it's not just a kind of negative fight, although I do think that we need to acknowledge that political and power dimension to this issue. Some of it is also trying to find more of the places where climate action brings concrete benefits now. And so this is the kind of idea behind the ideas of the Green New Deal, where you look to see the ways that taking action on climate now brings benefits in other kinds of sectors, where it helps you to solve air pollution issues or addresses housing issues, but that I think we need to work harder to build a political coalition in favor of climate action because of concrete benefits today. And not simply expect mobilization on the basis of future benefits. So we can see the ways in which renewable energy, for example, and building new wind and solar plants in various places can start to create what they call a green spiral of transition, and that it can create a workforce, an industry that then lobbies for further transition. We can try to build on some of those kinds of self-reinforcing tendencies. But I think that having an open acknowledgement of the politics of the situation and working both to confront the power of actors imbued in the fossil fuel industry, and then also trying to build actors in favor of action against, because of the concrete benefits today, are really some of the strategies that we would need to do. Because I think it's not just a matter of waiting for the economics to show us the price is right, but it's a matter of going on beyond that as well. And I have a lot more that I could say about that. I have 2 minutes left on my clock, and I'm trying to figure out what of this I say and what of it I hold to my next to my next thing, but I do think that, that this would be my general approach then, to think about how we build political coalitions around change, because in my view, it's less that the resources are not there and more that they are currently being spent on ways that do not advance transition rather than in ways that do advance transition. And in my mind, that is more of a political problem than it is an economic problem. So I think I will stop with that there and pass on.
Thank you very much, Kathy. So now let me move to Habib, and after that, I'll ask Adam.
Thank you very much, Padidi. It's a really great honor to be on such a distinguished panel, and I also wanted to thank the organizers for an excellent T20 summit. I really enjoyed some of the sessions yesterday. As Kathy mentioned, we hadn't prepared, but I find myself reaffirming some of the messages that both you and Montek-ji had highlighted in your interventions, particularly on the issue of the additionality of financing, but also whether climate actions can actually bring immediate development benefits and therefore change the political economy equation. So what I wanted to do is maybe to take a bit of a step back. Yesterday we spoke a lot about the energy transition, particularly from the technology focus, which we heard about, but also the financing focus, which we discussed just now. And to take more of a macro and growth perspective to the challenge, because I think, as Padede mentioned, that many countries see this as a luxury, speaking about climate objectives, about climate challenges. But in effect, if you can align climate actions with development objectives, then it might change that equation somewhat. And one clear example is the one on fossil fuel subsidies, which all of you have mentioned, which is a deadweight loss to the society, to the economy. So that is the example, or one example of the type of congruent climate action and development action that countries can take in order to facilitate the transition. But are there others? Is the question, and I think there are. So if we characterize the challenge of this decarbonization versus development, what we're in fact saying is that we are expecting developing countries to decouple emissions from economic growth. And an absolute decoupling, so the emissions will fall as growth accelerates. But no low-income or middle-income country has actually been able to graduate by doing so. So it's a challenge that we are posing, and a major economic transformation. Is it possible to do so going forward? Much of our modeling exercises suggest that it is possible, but there are a few issues that need to be taken into consideration. The first, I think, is how do you decarbonize development, not just decarbonize the supply of resources to the economy, so fossil fuel and land-based resources, but how do you decarbonize the demand side of the economy for those fossil fuel resources? Our focus tends to be a lot more on the supply side. So cutting the supply of carbon-intensive resources. Of course, there is discussion on the demand side as well, electric vehicles, climate-smart cities, climate-smart agriculture, and so forth. But it may be worth tilting the balance a little bit more, because these are new investments. As you expand power sector capacity, as Montek-ji was saying, you want to do that in a way that is more climate friendly. So decarbonizing the demand side for these resources in the economy, I think, is the first issue I wanted to raise. The second one is that if we dig a little bit deeper into one aspect of the demand side, which includes urbanization, agricultural production, industry. Within industry, one feedback that we have received from surveys that we have conducted across 30 different countries, including in Indonesia, is that companies or enterprises do not see investment in environmental management practices as a priority. Now, we heard an excellent example yesterday from Indonesia paper-based company that is in fact doing that and very impressively so. But most large enterprises, those that will drive decarbonization in the private sector, including through their linkages to medium and small enterprises, do not see this as a priority. Part of it is because of leverage. So many of them are incredibly indebted. The economic outlook is uncertain, so there is debt overhang, which prevents them from investing in these technology. But it's not just financing, it's also knowledge, it's also access to technology. These companies only know what they know, but to actually access new ways of managing production, supply chains, and so forth, they need external investment and knowledge, which they do not have access to. In fact, the surveys illustrate that those enterprises that have linkages to foreign direct investment companies tend to have better environmental management practices. So what to do about that? One is, of course, the debt restructuring, which was raised in your panel yesterday, Padide. But there may be others as well which more actively link technology transfer to enterprises in the developing world. The third point I wanted to raise is that it's not just sectoral policies that are important in the power sector, energy, even on the demand side in agriculture, urban transformation, and so forth. But it's also the enabling economic policies, and we mentioned a few, including the price signals that are given as a result of the implicit carbon price that is in the economy because of taxation of fossil fuels and offsetting subsidies. And I wanted to really stress this point because a lot of these enabling factors, structural reforms are in fact quite long-standing. Since the global financial crisis, there's been a lot of stalling on these structural reforms, which in fact have led to a misallocation of resources. So productivity growth in the decade prior to the COVID crisis was on a declining trend. And that has also meant that potential output has also been on a declining trend. So even though a lot of these emerging market and developing economies have seen an unprecedented rise in external financing, productivity did not increase. In fact, investment has been declining and debt has been rising. Padide, you spoke about your experience during the taper tantrum. This is an example of that, financing coming in, the economy not being able to absorb it productively, and the result not being what we expected it to be. And there are several areas of structural reform. Maybe I can come back to it during the discussion. They cover fiscal, which we already discussed, but also the financial system. The ability of the financial sector to generate greater depth in order to be able to absorb large additional, if indeed it is additional resources that are required, in order to allocate those not only to more productive but to greener parts of the economy. This brings me to the final point, which is on the financing. I don't mean to suggest that the financing is not. Of course, the financing is needed, and large amounts of financing is needed. But as Kathy had mentioned, I think it's also important to see how the existing pie is allocated, not just expanding the size of the pie, because there are distortions that have led to misallocation of resources. Montague spoke about the investment in coal relative to the investment in renewables. So how do you address some of these structural constraints so that the resources are in fact allocated to both more climate-friendly areas, but areas that are positive for development going forward? So my argument, I guess, is to look at this climate challenge from an economy-wide perspective, not just a sectoral perspective. Thank you very much. Let me pass it back to you.
Thank you very much, Habib. Now, last but not least, let me ask Adam.
Thanks very much. I wanted to pick up on that last point that was just made, which is around how can we get more private sector money into sustainable investment, and to focus on what I think is one of the really practical things that we could do, just one issue, that we could try and get more of that private money into those investments. I think the challenge was really highlighted quite powerfully in 2020. So in 2020, we got this report from the IPCC, which said that we had this gap on sustainable investment worth about $30 trillion, probably an understatement, out to 2030. At the exact same time, we had more than $20 trillion sitting in government bonds that were yielding a negative real return. So we've got this real paradox where you've got this enormous demand for sustainable investment. You had this ample amount of cash that was sitting around. In fact, it was sitting in assets that were losing money. We had a clear problem in terms of intermediation. So how do we get those savings into those sustainable investments? One of the issues that I wanted to focus on, and we've done the modelling on this, and it suggests you could potentially close that gap by about a third, and it relates to the global capital rules, or the Basel III rules. So among other things, these rules require banks to hold capital on their balance sheets in order to make them more resilient to shocks, whether those be financial crises or shocks for their particular bank. Obviously, capital, there's different qualities of capital. A US Treasury bond is going to be a lot safer than, say, equities or Bitcoin or something like that. And as a result, these rules will provide and prescribe what makes different forms of capital better quality. Now, one of the big issues we've got, though, is that these rules don't take into account sustainability. And this is a really big issue because a lot of the research that has been coming out shows that green borrowers are better borrowers. So if you have good green credentials, you're less likely to default on your loan, you're less likely to be late on your repayments, and you're overall a safer borrower. This has been showed using Chinese data, using European data, and also in the United States and parts of Southeast Asia as well. So we've got this pretty clear link that green borrowers are better borrowers, and in a well-functioning market, we would expect that those borrowers would get lower interest rates, which would therefore encourage more investment from them because they'd have a lower cost of capital. We're seeing this to some extent, but not to the extent that we would expect. And a big part of this is because of these capital rules. So if we were to incorporate sustainability metrics into these capital rules, banks would straight away have an incentive to hold more green debt on their balance sheets. There'd be an incentive to issue more green debt, and we'd see an increase in sustainable investment as a result. Now, the modelling work that we've done on this, as I say, suggests that this, if you were to do this, this will close that gap identified by the IPCC, that $30 trillion sustainable investment gap, by close to a third, so about $10 trillion of additional sustainable investment out to 2030. The really important point here as well is that the overwhelming beneficiaries are developing countries. And that's because you see this enormous boom in investment around the world, and the capital goods and the resources that get exported into those, that investment boom tend to come from developing countries. So Indonesia alone sees about $320 billion of additional sustainable investment out to 2030 just by changing this rule. So these are one of the key things that we should be looking at. There's a whole variety of reasons as to why it is that private sector money is struggling to be intermediated into sustainable investments. But this strikes me as being one of those lower hanging fruit things that we could potentially do. It's more technocratic. There's not a huge amount of politics in it as well, which can make it a little bit easier. But it's not something we can do straight away. There's a lot of barriers that we face in being able to actually do this. One of the biggest barriers is around taxonomies, which is a fancy way of saying that we can't agree on what constitutes green, what constitutes a green firm or a green debt or a green loan. If we have a look, for example, at the firms that provide credit check ratings on companies, those different rating agencies, they agree with each other about 99% of the time. So they're pretty consistent in terms of whether or not a firm is has good credit worthiness or not. Whereas when we look at the same from ESG rating agencies, they agree with each other less than 50% of the time. In fact, recently they've identified a variety of companies as being really good on environmental issues who then went bankrupt because they got slogged with a huge cleanup bill because they were environmental scandals. So we've got a really big problem here in terms of getting agreement between countries on what constitutes green. And this is one of the foundational things we need to address. We're seeing a lot of work in this space. China and the EU are doing a lot of work on trying to agree on these taxonomies. There's a lot of work in Latin America as well. The risk, though, is we end up with this inconsistent patchwork of different taxonomies rather than leading this out of a forum like the G20 where we can get some kind of global agreement. The other big challenge we've got is data. And certainly for our work, we use the Refinitiv data set. It's quite easy to get data around developed countries, much harder for developing countries. So we need to have a lot more technical assistance to provide that data, which also makes markets function more effectively on their own. If there's more data available for lenders, that they can use this to critique different businesses. So data is a big part of this story as well. And the third big challenge that we have is around technology. So that is the sorts of technologies we need to really collect this data in the first place. In some instances, remote sensing technologies and other technologies that are used to actually collect data on emissions and liability risks and things like that. But you can see that these three things sort of sketch out a bit of an agenda for the G20, that if it is able to come up with these agreed taxonomies on what constitutes green and sustainable, if it can come up with some technical assistance around data and data access, if it can come up with more assistance around technology, it lays this groundwork for then reforming these global capital rules, which then substantially boosts sustainable investment. The other beauty of this is it tends to tick a lot of boxes for the G20. One of the key boxes it ticks is obviously on climate change. The other is on investment, something that the G20 has struggled with for close to 10 years is how do we boost more investment. So it ticks both of those boxes. It's also very important for financial stability. If you've got a whole bunch of businesses who have got these enormous environmental risks on their balance sheets, if they get hit with some kind of cleanup bill, well, that business goes out of business. It then transmits through the lender. It becomes a broader financial stability issue as well. So properly pricing risk is not just good for climate change, it's also good for financial stability as well, which is another key focus of the G20. Finally, it's one of these very unique areas, and it's an area that's getting smaller and smaller, which is where the US and China can actually agree on something. It's been a huge priority in China. The PBOC has done a lot of work looking at sustainable investment and looking at what we can do with these capital rules. Many in the US see it as an opportunity to have more of a private sector focus on addressing climate change as well, which even in the US is one of these areas that's a little bit less politically charged and has better prospects for moving through that space. So I think we've spoken a bit here already about just the size of this investment challenge, and realistically we won't be able to meet this even close using public money. We're going to need a lot of private sector money in order to achieve this. So we really need to start focusing more on what are those key barriers. And in terms of low-hanging fruit, one of those barriers is probably the capital rules that we put in place, which is constraining not just green finance, but also investment in infrastructure to a large extent as well, given that the length of these investments, the role that some of these rules play in really limiting that as well. So hopefully that's a practical suggestion on how we can try and achieve some of these particular issues. But back to you.
Excellent, Adams. So I think we have enough ingredient for discussion. We discuss about some of the challenges, the political economy issue, some of the potential solution as well. Before I go to the second round, I was quite surprised because there are so many participants here. It's a bit rare for the parallel session actually. It's like a plenary, which is somehow this is a good sign because it shows the refilled preference of this topic, because so many participants would like to hear, and perhaps we'll give a comment later on. So this is a good signal. But let me start to pose a question. I will start with you, Montek. You are a former Minister of Planning in India, have been very instrumental in big reform in India. So let me take what Kathy said about the trade-off between the long-term and the short-term issue. So my question is, at the given political constraint that probably many governments will focus on the short-term issue due to the political cycle, what kind of opportunities or maybe potential that developing countries can speed up in the green transition?
No, I think, look, this is the basic issue that you're here playing for the longer term. whereas in any political system, it's virtually impossible to get any political actors to think about what is good in the longer term as opposed to what it costs in the short term. So the truth of the matter is that if you want to make the transition that we're talking about, governments will have to be persuaded that in the longer term interest, you've got to do a whole lot of things right now which do involve higher costs. Is that easy? Definitely not. To my mind, you know, in order for governments to take those decisions, in any kind of democratic or responsive system, governments act on the basis of what they think their voters will applaud them for. So if you don't have an informed voter opinion where people are saying, listen, why aren't you doing something, you're really not going to get action. Now, it's not as if nothing is happening. I mean, young people, for example, really young people are quite interested and involved. But I don't think we've translated into people's appreciation that if you really care about climate change, then this is what I have to do now, and you've got to support me. Somehow the approach is that, look, yes, if you ask for a vote, should we try to limit global warming? I mean, the vote will be overwhelming. Of course you should. But then you turn to the issue of is it relevant to affect energy prices, to give the right signals? The approach will be no. You know, let me just give you one simple example. In India, there are certain LED bulbs which are hugely more energy efficient than incandescent bulbs. And since the capital cost on these bulbs is quite low, and the government was subsidizing it a bit, almost 97% of the bulbs used now are LED bulbs. Now that looks very good. You have the same situation with electric fans. There are energy efficient fans and there are energy inefficient fans. The difference is that the capital cost of an energy efficient fan is substantially greater than the capital cost of an energy inefficient fan. And of the total fans in India, only 3% are the energy efficient ones. And now, if people are going to be getting, particularly at the lower income groups, if electricity prices are kept very low, then either you subsidize the energy efficient fan or people are just not going to buy it. So, I mean, it's a classic case where in the absence of the right price incentive, you won't get the change you want. Now, I recognize that you can't just reduce, I mean, you mentioned this earlier, you can't reduce everything to prices, but you can't keep them, you can't ignore that either. This is the point. And I don't think that we're having a debate, I mean, I'm saying in India, I think we haven't as yet got a whole lot of people focused on, look, this is a good thing, why don't you do it? The only thing that gets focused on is government programs. There's always a lot of support for a government program that spends a lot of money. But I've never seen any great pressure to get some prices right. And that's a real problem, you know?
Thank you, Montek. So now let me move to Kathy. Let me share with you my sort of like a very brief discussion with the former president of World Bank, Jim Kim, at the time. Because the multilateral agency would like to sort of like come up with the recommendation. I call it this first rate. But the problem is can only be implemented about 10 to 15 years from now because this will require the goods institution. Yeah, jokingly I said what we need in the short term is best fit, not best practice. So you mentioned about the importance of this, you know, political economy setup. So my question is related to the what kind of the institutional setup need to be sort of like to be put in place, especially for the developing countries, given that probably our institution or the political situation is probably less established compared to developed countries. If you can share your view on this, that will be great.
Yeah, I'm going to answer that out of a project that I was recently working on, led by Navraz Dubash, who's an Indian social scientist. And we looked specifically at the major emitters, including a number of developing countries, and we're asking really the question of what kinds of climate institutions look like they work. And what we ended up talking about was that well, first of all, that you couldn't expect just one kind of climate institution to work, that sometimes governments want to know what's the model, what can we do, what can we set up, and that instead we thought it was more important to talk about 3 specific tasks that we thought any kind of institution should meet these 3 tasks. And exactly what the institution would look somewhat different from country to country, but that they had to do these 3 things. One of them was what we called addressing the coordination challenge, and this is what refers to the fact that climate change, of course, doesn't only appear in the energy area, but it appears across many different sectors. And so one of the problems that many countries have with their climate institutions is that they make them the Ministry of Environment, which is typically one of the weakest institutions in a country, especially in developing countries. You can't put your Ministry of the Environment alone in charge of climate politics. You have to have either a specific institution or an interministerial institution or some way of coordinating so that your actor that is the one in charge of climate politics actually has some authority to address energy issues and transportation and the whole array of sectors that are involved in climate change. So sometimes countries do that, as in the case of Brazil, where they had an interministerial commission. Sometimes countries do it like South Africa, where they had an interministerial commission, but they left out the Ministry of Energy, which energy is the source of most of South Africa's greenhouse gas emissions. So we were looking at both positive and negative examples of this, but everybody had to address the coordination issue in some way, or you weren't going to be able to address climate change. Then, if you think coordination's difficult, the next problem was that you had to find institutions that could really go for transformation. And here you find a problem that we've hinted at in some ways that, I mean, you can build a lot more renewable energy. But if at the same time that you're building renewable energy, you're also subsidizing your fossil fuels and you're investing in developing your petroleum sector, you know, you're not going to be reaching transformation. So you have to be able to think about the climate agenda as a transformative agenda and think about what kinds of choices would actually reach whole-scale transition and not just more renewable energy, for example, which a lot of countries are doing, and a lot of finance is actually, coming back to the finance question, there's a lot of the finance focus is about, well, how do we find more finance for renewable energy? But if we don't look at what we're spending in the other sectors, we won't be doing transformative action. And then a final issue that we were looking at was that there's a kind of conundrum, which is that it goes back to this long-term, short-term thing. That in order to really take convincing action on climate change, you do have to have a long-term vision, and you have to, in some ways, lock yourself in to low-carbon transitions and low-carbon commitments. But at the same time, one of the things about climate change is that it's always transforming the reality that you're dealing with. And so you have to have institutions that are both committed to climate action, but also flexible institutions that can change over time as the climate issue itself changes as an issue. And then just to go back to my original point, part of what you have to do then is not just create these institutions, but also work very hard to create the political coalition that will support them. And here I think we're very much in agreement that, you know, that governments act when people demand it, and that developing that political coalition that will back up these institutions is really a key part of it. So we didn't imagine that every country was going to be putting these institutions in place, but it was more a matter of trying to figure out what kinds of institutions had to be put there as a way of thinking about what sorts of problems would have to be solved with the institutions. So I'm not sure if that's really properly an answer to your question, but it tells you some of our thinking about what we looked at and saw seemed to work and seemed to not work.
Thank you, Kathy. Now let me move to Habib. You mentioned in your remarks about the importance of, for example, like decarbonizing, so sort of like to reduce the demand side of it. This kind of approach, probably I'll call it a sort of like a unilateral reform because it's come from within. But in addition to that, there is also a need for the country for this cooperation with global, yeah, and then ask what's in it for me if I do this green transition, not only from the country perspective. So I was wondering if you can share with us what will be the maybe example of the coordination between developed and developing countries can do to ensure the smooth green transition.
Thank you very much, Padidi. So there is, several different dimensions to this. I mean, of course, there is the financing angle, where in order to plug some of the savings investment gap for a lot of these developing countries, it will rely a lot in terms of cooperating both with public and private sector, as Adam had also mentioned, in order to ensure that capital flows are targeted towards green investments. The second one, which I think is probably even more important, is the transfer of technologies, because a lot of these technologies are actually developed in developed countries, are emanating from developed countries. That has changed somewhat in the last 4 or 5 years as China, Brazil, South Africa start to develop more climate-friendly technologies, but a lot of them are actually coming from developed economies. And that transfer of technology, whether through public channels or through multinational enterprises, foreign direct investment in developing countries, is really really critical area of cooperation. The third, which relates to that, is the area of international trade. We have done quite a lot of analysis, looking at the extent to which environmental goods are discriminated against. So the amount of tariff or non-tariff barriers that are applied on environmental goods imports, which are not necessarily produced domestically. And there is quite a big agenda there as well, because that also affects the relative prices of access to green technologies. But then the fourth is that in order for a lot of these international linkages to work, and for the financing and technology to transfer, I do think that there is a lot to do on the domestic structural reform agenda. One example is that in some areas there are preferential treatment, local content requirements in the production of environmental products or technologies, which have very significant startup costs, both in terms of knowledge and capacity, but also financing. So why not partner or allow some of these technologies to come in, which actually leads to the development and strengthening of domestic industries. We've seen this in particular in Vietnam, say, for example, that has moved up the value chain from assembly to more actual domestic manufacturing, thanks to this international linkages. Other behind-the-border policies, include, of course, formal competition policy, which affect whether or not there are barriers to entry into investment in environmental goods production. But there are others also. I mean, Adam mentioned some of the constraints from an international perspective on capital flows, the Basel requirements, but even in the domestic financial system, the ability to assess risk as a result of climate disasters, but also of green investments. And that capacity is actually lacking. And often green investments are priced at a much higher rate than at a lower rate, whereas as you argue, it should actually be priced at a lower rate because these green investors are better credit risks. So these are some of the things I would say, that the international also depends on some of the domestic policies that countries implement.
Thank you, Habib. Now let me move to Adam. I want to dig deeper for your idea, your proposal. Yeah, my question is related that do you expect there will be a sort of like a negative implication for this reform in the short term? And if there is, what kind of mitigation or anticipations are needed in order to minimize the impact?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, I mean, what it does result in is a reallocation of resources and a reallocation of capital. So, if you imagine you've got a particular sector and you've got a bunch of firms within that sector who have really good green credentials, and you've got a bunch that don't have good green credentials, the outcome of this reform is that the ones who have good green credentials can now borrow for cheaper compared to the ones that don't. So you do see a reallocation away from dirty firms, to call them that, towards green firms as a consequence of that. So we see that within sectors. We also see it across sectors. So we see it across a country. You'll see more of the capital shifting towards the greener sectors of the economy, and you see it globally. And this is something that we've looked at in the paper, that you do see a shift of capital away from countries that don't have very many green firms towards the countries that do. So there's a lot of green firms, and part of this is a data issue. There's a lot of green firms in Europe, for example, in the United States. So they see more of a benefit in terms of that lower cost of capital, and they see more capital shifting into those economies. Is this a bad thing? Well, not really, because in the world of sort of general equilibrium economics, there's an offsetting effect here as well, and that's exchange rates. So one of the key things is that if some countries benefit more than others and they pull in more capital, their exchange rate goes up. And that means that the countries that don't have as many green firms still benefit because they benefit through the trade channel as well. So when we look at the overall effect, the net beneficiaries tend to be developing countries, and it's mostly because of that trade effect. That when the rest of the world is all acting at the same time, they're the ones who supply a lot of the resources and a lot of the capital goods that then feed into this big investment boom there as well. None of this is to say, of course, that the government doesn't still have a very strong role to play in government spending as well. And this goes to something I think you talked about yesterday, Dede, which was around debt restructuring, for example. I think something we do need to think about as well is what can we do to boost the fiscal space of developing countries so that governments can actually undertake some of these investments as well. We saw this during COVID, where developed countries, spent hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars without markets batting an eyelid. There was no punishment for them. They didn't receive any negative response from international markets. They just went ahead and spent like drunken sailors. Whereas developing countries were much more constrained, particularly those who have a lot of foreign denominated debt. If they tried to spend lots of money, investors would withdraw money from their economy, the exchange rate would drop, and that debt would get bigger, potentially triggering an overall financial crisis. Developing countries spent a lot more during COVID than they could have in previous crises, like the Asian financial crisis, for example. But nevertheless, they still had the handbrake on. So we do need to think, as the G20, what can we do internationally to boost the fiscal space of these countries? And a lot of that is about trying to address those market concerns that they're going to run out of foreign exchange reserves. And a big part of that is about having swap lines between countries like we had during the global financial crisis, having an IMF that does a better job of providing liquidity quickly to countries that are in trouble with fewer conditions. Certainly in Indonesia, but in a lot of countries in Asia, they'd prefer to crawl over broken glass than go to the IMF. So we need to address some of those big stigma issues as well. So it's both a private story, but it's also a public debt story as well. And I think if we think about that in that sense, any of those short-term negative effects that some countries might receive, if we do this holistically, we can address those and make sure that it's politically palatable and everyone is winning from the reform.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We have 20 minutes now because there are so many participants here. I think it's about time to open the discussion for floor. So let me invite if there are any questions from the floors. One. Okay, so many. Okay, let me start with the first round for the 3 questions. Yeah, you're number 1, the one in the behind. Alex, you're number 2, and then you're number 3. Okay. Could you please introduce yourself, and then if you want to ask a specific question to the panelists.
Echo from Tropical Renewable Energy Center, University of Indonesia. If you see in 1970, people power or big demonstration in Germany to against the nuclear power plant. In 1980, if you read the book about the Energiewende, about the transitions, the book is talking about energy transition, growth and prosperity without oil and nuclear power plant. This is from Freiburg University. And then in 1990, the German released the first renewable energy law. So German needs around 20 years to make the first renewable energy law. And I see this is the prime offer is the people. People try to change against power, nuclear power plant, and oil. And after 30 years, in developing countries...
Could you speed up your question, because there are so many people will ask a question here.
Okay. At Germany, the prime offer is the people. But in the developing countries like Indonesia and Brazil and also India, this is the issue coming from a global. People doesn't any feel, they are not involved about this issue. Even in Indonesia, our utility grid company doesn't agree about photovoltaic rooftop. Yeah. So this is, I don't know, maybe we need 10 years or 20 years to start the renewable energy or energy transitions. The question is how to involve the people to know and involve to change this big issue, green transition. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, the transition, that's a very important issue. Alex?
My name is Alex Irwan. I'm from the Ford Foundation, Indonesia. I have a question for Habib and Adam. This is concerning Indonesia. Like, how much resources domestically that is actually available for the country to finance the green transition, provided, Kathy, that we don't face any political obstacles? Like, for example, the government just reduced fossil fuel subsidy just a couple of days ago. You know, but election is coming up in 2024, so it's not going to be spent on financing for closing the gap for the financing of the renewable energy. And also a couple of days ago, I just talked to somebody from the Bappenas. Bappenas is the national planning agencies regarding exactly in the green bonds that they are not earmarked, you know, for spending on renewable and climate change activities. So if, for example, those kind of domestic resources in Indonesia are actually without no political obstacles, all are put in this transition of green development in Indonesia, would Indonesia still need international assistance, like more debts, you know, from the IMF or on the World Bank, or actually the domestic resources is sufficient, provided that there is no obstacle for the reallocation? Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. I am Karim Choukri, the professor researcher from Hassan II University in Morocco, former head of Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Department in the Ministry of Energy Transition and Sustainable Development. Firstly, I would like to thank our panelists for this interesting debate and discussions. Of course, today it's not easy, really, it's not easy to talk about energy. today, the context we are living a very amazing situation. What happened today in Europe really make us in a very how to say, a very specific situation. Just 1 year before, who can imagine that Germany will rethink about coal? He can imagine that Brussels will stop the shutdown of its nuclear power and think to build other nuclear power? Who can say that the gas and the nuclear will be green? Which means that really it's a very specific situation. Maybe for developing countries, I think we should develop our own energy transition, our own way. Yes, we will reach the same station, but maybe not by the same way. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's more on a comment. So perhaps let me ask anyone who would like to start to respond. Questions for Habib and Adam from Alex, and maybe from Eko, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Probably other panelists would like to respond regarding the energy transition. Yeah, looking at the case of the Germany and how to be implemented in the case of developing countries. So let me start with Habib or Adam. You want to start first?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a great question, Alex. So the question was around sort of what are the actual resources available in Indonesia for sustainable investment? I know one of the really sort of controversial issues in Indonesia is around having a current account deficit and whether or not Indonesia should be borrowing money from abroad or whether or not it should be using its own domestic savings. For me, I think Indonesia is an emerging economy. It has enormous amounts of investment which need to take place, and in that context, it makes perfect sense for Indonesia to be borrowing money internationally to finance that. If there's surplus savings in Indonesia when you've got all this investment which needs to take place, that really shows that there's a problem there, that savings isn't being used as effectively as possible. So what are the resources available to Indonesia? I mean, I would argue they really should be borrowing abroad, but this is when you start to come into these financial stability concerns. So, I mean, Indonesia, I think, has about $460 billion of foreign denominated debt. So the concern there is that if they borrow too much internationally, markets get nervous, investors pull their money out, the exchange rate drops, and that stock of debt, because it's denominated in US dollars predominantly, gets bigger and bigger, and then it can sort of threaten financial stability. So, I mean, that goes back to that major sort of need for international cooperation on these issues, where we do need the international community to provide countries like Indonesia with those supports to make sure that they can borrow more internationally, and where you've got these huge surpluses of savings sitting in developed countries that could be being used for productive investment in developing countries. We need to better bridge those two gaps there, and really that falls down to the international community to address those challenges. It has to be said, of course, that Indonesia, certainly over the last 20 years, 30 years, has radically changed in terms of its ability to borrow internationally and to borrow denominated in its own currency. And that's fundamentally about the reforms that have taken place domestically as well. So there's a huge amount of reform and effort that has been done over these years, but there's still a lot more that could be done internationally to try and support developing countries. But in terms of resources, where does it come from? I mean, my answer would be that it comes internationally. It's fundamentally where it should be flowing from.
Habib, you want to add?
Thank you very much. Alex, on your question, I think it depends in part, how ambitious the decarbonization program is. So, at the very basic level, the elimination of the subsidies would generate a certain amount of savings. In fact, we've estimated that if you reallocate some of the savings from the elimination of the subsidies, you still generate around 0.5% of GDP in extra fiscal space that you can spend on other priority areas. But then the emissions reduction is not as significant. So if you supplement that with, say, for example, carbon pricing and a fiscal framework that is more geared towards taxing fossil fuels rather than incentivizing their consumption, then that would lead to additional fiscal space in order to help you rechannel investment towards renewable energy. But then that also is not necessarily the whole story, because your external financing requirement, but Didi will know better, but is around 5 to 10% of GDP annually, your financing and refinancing requirements. The question is, what type of financing is needed in order to encourage the green transition? Securitized debt, I'm not sure is the solution. Equity financing, that could be, but portfolio equity also doesn't come with the knowledge and the technology that is needed to encourage the transition. Foreign direct investment, yes, that could certainly help. So it's really the type of financing that also comes in to support the green transition. But it would have to be, I agree with Adam, that it would have to be a mix of domestic resources and foreign resources, because your overall investment rate is not low. It's at around 30% of GDP, which is very, very respectable, right? The question is that you want to reallocate that pie using a combination of both domestic and international resources.
Kathy?
South Africa here by any chance? Because I actually want to use South Africa as an example to answer a couple of these questions. And the first question, for example, how do you motivate a population? I mean, the South African context, which is also has been 95% dependent on coal for electricity, has quite a substantial civil society coalition called the Life Beyond Coal Coalition that has taken up exactly this kind of question. It's taken a number of different strategies. It has produced studies, for example, of the pollution in coal communities, and so has really highlighted the fact that there are concrete costs of coal use and production and mining now. So again, thinking about how you articulate the co-benefits of current action, they've been highlighting the real costs of coal. They have an arm that has brought a number of legal cases that have been very important, actually, in particular decisions blocking, for example, nuclear power, which they were trying to block. But there's quite an interesting coalition there, and you might be interested in looking at some of the South African experiences with that. And then just another angle on Alex's question, the South African answer to this question is also quite interesting, because South Africa has an unusual auction system for electricity where 70% of the bid is based on price. So it's looking for cheaply built wind and solar plants. But then 30% of the bid is based on some of the additional development ambitions South Africa has for its renewable energy, so that it wants the communities that host renewable energy projects to have part ownership of the projects. It wants the communities that host the projects to have labor for Black South Africans, jobs for Black South Africans. And so there's been a really interesting division in the financing packages for South African wind and solar plants, which is that private finance finances the actual building of the wind tower and the plant itself, that it generates the electricity, and then the South African development banks have been financing that other 30%, the community ownership, the local content requirements, and those kinds of things. So they've made that kind of split between what it is that the international or the private finance covers and what public finance covers. So public finance in some ways covers the sort of the public purposes, the co-benefits that South Africa also wants to get from a wind power plant beyond simple electricity. So it's an interesting model, I think, to think about how you might actually join different sources of finance in the same project for different kinds of purposes.
No, I think no, going back to the question of how do you motivate the people, because I mean, in any system where governments, one way or the other, are going to be responsive to voters, that is actually a central question. To be honest, I don't have a good answer, because having been involved in planning for a long time, I think one of the problems with climate change is that the time period is too long. I mean, nobody seriously can think about 40 years from now, or even 30 years from now. So I think you do need to translate it into a workable sort of 10-year target and convince people that this is something good. Now, certainly in India, I think 80% of our electricity at the moment comes from coal. So it's only a little bit better than South Africa. To me, the most important thing is essentially the decarbonization of the production of electricity. We have a big advantage in terms of solar power. We are now seeing an increase in renewable energy, quite substantial. But you know, it's nowhere near what it needs to be. I mean, roughly at the moment, 11% of our electricity comes from renewables, wind and solar. And you know, if we had to make a break, make a significant gain in the whole climate change thing, then almost 60 or 70% of it should come from renewable power by the year 2060 or so. Now that, I mean, how do you mobilize people? I mean, one way you do it is to persuade the industry that this is a huge economic opportunity. Because obviously, that's the way you develop, I'm afraid, vested interests. Not so much the people generally. I mean, they're basically interested in electricity and they want it cheap. They're not really interested in where it comes from. I think we underestimate the extent to which if you like, the magic of selling an idea is ultimately a political skill. It's not done on an economic calculation that if you do this, your productivity or income will be that much higher. And that's really going to be the test of the system. There are a few people who are actually deeply involved in climate change. But you know, I think they're still in the agitational phase. I mean, the real sign of success will be if the guys who are involved in climate change begin to have their representatives in Parliament who are actually pushing in that direction. I see Mr. Ramesh Chand, who's one of our most distinguished agricultural economists in the government, and he will know that, look, why are we worrying, why are we puzzled about climate change? Look at the treatment of scarcity of water. I mean, this has been known in India for the last 30 years, that we are not adequately operating how to manage this very, very scarce resource. And I don't know, maybe Ramesh, you want to tell us something, whether there's progress here or not. That in a way, I think the problem of the commons is really tough. And I mean, that's where really somehow the political system is the only way that, you know, you can say, well, look, this is what we've got to do. And I do think that younger people, people below the age of 15, are much more likely to get motivated in this sort of direction than older people. Because younger people are not tied in to a particular lifestyle. And I think we haven't really scratched the surface. I would say that, at least in India, we haven't made the commitment to climate change a movement of any significant kind at the moment. And I find it difficult to believe that we're going to move from 11% renewable electricity to 70% without somehow having made it a bit of a movement. How to do that, I really don't know. We need to think.
Thank you, Montek. I think this is really a great discussion, but unfortunately, time is up. I believe there are many questions from the audience, but unfortunately, we have to stop at 10 a.m. I don't want to take the coffee break time from you. But before we conclude the session, I don't want to make a summary of this discussion. It's so rich, so many issues that we need to address. Yeah, but I think we have enough ingredient, food for thought, to prepare for the next step. Yeah, but before I conclude this session, let me invite all of you to give the big round of applause to our excellent panelists. So thank you very much. Yeah, Montek, Kathy, Adam, and Habib. You can see this parallel session is like a plenary because so many interests in this issue. So thank you very much then.
Thank you.